Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are continuing on with rating every single spell in Baldur's Gate with the level 2 spells. As you know, I like to go back and look at the previous levels tier list and kind of integrate everyone's feedback into my tier list, move things around based on people's comments, but as I'm recording this, I haven't yet posted part 2 of my tier 1 spells list, so we'll have to wait until next time to go review that one. I also, before I begin, just have a couple quick thank yous to say. So thank you so much to Charles William and Destructicon for becoming channel members, as well as McDonough and Paul Bailey for staying channel members for a third and second month, respectively. Thanks so much, my friends. I really appreciate it. As well as Tenshi for the $5, Charles William again for the $10, super generous of you, and Trengeli for the $5. Once again, super appreciated. Thanks so much, my friends. Alright, by this point you probably know the drill, but let's just quickly reiterate these tiers and talk about how I am going to be rating the spells. So in S tier spells, we have critical spells, ones that you will always take and you're genuinely hurting your character by not taking them. In A tier, we have great spells that are going to be useful and powerful throughout the game. B tier, we have useful spells, ones that are solid role players that you're often going to prepare, but are not necessarily critical. In C tier, marginal spells that are either for a very specific build or have very narrow use cases. And in D tier, we have weak spells that are usually superseded by other options. I have elected not to use an F tier for spells because there are very few spells that have genuinely no use in Baldur's Gate. There's a couple spells, mostly damage spells, that are just fully dominated by other options, but there are very few spells that are genuinely useless in the way that there are, say, useless feats or skills. So that's why there's no F tier. I also should mention, just because I think it's a question that's come up a couple times as I've been going through these tier lists, that some of the bias that I have when I'm rating these tiers is that I don't like to long rest after every fight. So I am rating spells in part based on how much they contribute to a day where you're trying to actually minimize your resource use. You may want to move some burst damage spells and stuff up a little bit if you are a player who long rests after every fight. So just a small bias, I guess, in how I'm judging these spells. Alright, without further ado, let's jump in and talk about the level 2 spells. First up, Aid. So Aid is a cleric spell, and it, as well as Paladin, and at level 2 spell slot, it gives your whole team, everybody in the AoE, 5 extra hit points. Importantly, these extra hit points are not temporary hit points. It actually adds to your base hit points. So when you short rest and gain back a percentage of your maximum hit points, you gain more hit points back if you have Aid cast on you. And it stacks with other sources of temporary hit points. So it's very useful in that these are effectively temporary hit points, but you can heal them and you can gain extra benefit from short rests with them, and they stack with other sources. When you upcast Aid, you get 5 more hit points per spell level, up to 25 additional hit points for a level 6 casting of Aid, and it hits everybody in the AoE, so you can use it for summons, you can use it for familiars, you can use it for animal companions, all of which will benefit from Aid. It is also the only way in the game to heal undead, and because it gives you back 5 hit points as well as increasing your hit point maximum, it's going to be able to heal undead, unlike every other healing spell in the game. So if you are a necromancer, then you absolutely have to have this. Aid is a very difficult spell to rate, honestly, because there's several unintended uses that make it extraordinarily powerful. One is that it hits everything in the AoE. I mean, that's an intended use, but not really part of the normal balance of the spell. So if you have 20 summons, then it's getting 20 times as much value, or 5 times as much value as it is when it's only hitting 4 party members. It also can be cast by a camp follower, and then will still benefit your actual adventuring party throughout the entire day. So the most powerful way to use Aid is on a hireling or a party member who's staying back at home and not actually joining you. The question, I think, and the way that I'm going to approach rating this spell is, how good is it if you use it sort of as the spell is intended to be used, where it actually requires you to spend a level 2 spell slot on it, or level 2 or higher spell slot on it, and it's hitting, maybe 5 or 6 characters, including a familiar and an animal companion, not 20 summons. Obviously, for builds that are revolving around those use cases, or if you're using it for a hireling, then it is an unbelievably powerful spell. The answer, though, is that even when you're using this spell as it's intended to be used, it's still just really good, and most adventuring parties are going to want to have access to it and to cast it most adventuring days. In the early game, starting at level 3, I wouldn't necessarily have Aid up all the time, but at later levels, it's often going to be the best use of a level 2 spell anyways, and even in the early game, it can still be very powerful, even if it's costing you a cast of an actual level 2 spell, and you're not getting it for free. It can also be cast from scrolls, and weirdly can be learned by a wizard if they are multi-classed with Cleric from a scroll, which isn't, that shouldn't work, but it does because of how wizard casting works in Baldur's Gate. So you can actually get this on Cleric or Paladin characters as well. Aid is just an incredible spell. I'm going to put it in S tier, both because of the sort of abusive use corner cases, and also just because, even by default, it's just an incredibly good spell. If you only ever cast it as a level 2 spell, and you never use it from a party member who's staying behind for that fight or something like that, you could probably bump it down to A tier, but given how many powerful uses there are for it and how many corner cases it has, this is just an incredible spell, and even without those corner cases, it's already extremely good. Arcane Lock. Arcane Lock is another weird one to rate, which is kind of funny that there's so many of those at level 2, because its main use is an abusive AI breaking, I guess not exactly a bug, but kind of an exploit. How Arcane Lock works is that you can close a container or a door and it becomes locked. The only way to open it is by breaking it. Can't be lockpicked, can't be knocked, not that enemies will do that anyways in Baldur's Gate. This is, in tabletop, just a role-playing spell, right? It's to stop people from stealing your stuff, but nobody tries to do that in Baldur's Gate, so in that way, it's completely useless. But what you can do is completely break certain encounters by locking a door with an enemy on the other side of them. Some encounters will have an enemy scripted to move through a door, and if you lock that door, then the AI completely breaks, and they just stand there doing nothing for the rest of the encounter. For example, with Auntie Ethel, she's scripted to go through her door, and if you lock it with Arcane Lock, she will stand there and do nothing, not even attempt to fight for the rest of the encounter, and you can just take her down using cantrips or whatever for the rest of the fight. Outside of that abusive corner case, Arcane Lock is useless. So it's kind of hard to rate because it's based on its usefulness is very, very powerful in the encounters that it breaks, but it is kind of based on an exploit, and if the AI was programmed to actually attack the doors and try to go through them, I have seen them do this sometimes, but it is very inconsistent, and they usually just stand there doing nothing. Then it would be sort of an interesting spell. As is, I'm going to assume that you're not doing that because personally I don't find it that fun, but obviously it's very powerful and is something that you definitely can do if you want to. That being said, if you do want to break the AI by blocking them off from doorways, you can also stack crates or barrels in front of them, so even the sort of abusive corner case of this spell is something that you can do just with environmental objects, and you don't have to actually spend a spell slot on it. So for that reason, because its only use is based on sort of an exploit, and because even then you can exploit the game in an easier way just by putting barrels in front of doors, I'm going to rate Arcane Lock D tier. Barkskin. Barkskin is a day-long concentration spell that sets a character's base armor class to 16. Normally the base armor class is 10. This will set it to 16. It will not work with armor, so you won't be able to add additional armor class to it. It basically counts as wearing a suit of armor. So you won't be able to add additional AC to it by wearing armor on top of it. But 16 is a decent AC, especially at level 3. You're only going to be able to get AC 16 plus your dexterity with I guess a +1 breastplate does that, but other than that, there's basically no options for getting AC that good at this early in the game. That being said, it takes a level 2 spell slot and your concentration until long rest. Because it's a concentration spell, you can't even have a camp follower cast it, because when you leave camp, they'll lose concentration on it. Overall, I think that Barkskin is a pretty weak use of a spell, although there are some characters that can benefit from it. If you have a wizard or something, you can use this in place of mage armor. But just the fact that it takes your concentration in order to gain a marginal increase to your AC is sort of similar to Shield of Faith. Not only does it require your concentration, which means you'll lose it if you get hit, it also comes at a huge opportunity cost. You can't concentrate on anything else during a fight when you have Barkskin up, and you lose guidance and so on that character throughout the day, which means that if you cast it at the beginning of the day, you're giving up a tremendous bonus on your skill checks from that character, because druids can take guidance, in order to have access to Barkskin. Generally speaking, I would not advise taking Barkskin. I think maybe there's like 1 or 2 characters that could benefit from it, but overall you're going to be much better off never casting this spell, D-tier spell. Blindness. Blindness is a non-concentration, 10-turn duration, 60-foot range crowd control spell, all of which are really good things for it to be. So the question is, how easy is it to land, and how good is the effect? The answer is that it's a constitution saving throw, which enemies are typically going to be quite good at. That's one of the saves that is harder to target in Baldur's Gate, because enemies will often have high con saves. So it won't land that often, but blindness is a pretty good condition. Blinding something for 10 turns based on only 1 save is very powerful, and against bosses this could be a very crippling effect. The fact that it only has 1 save and doesn't take your concentration is very powerful. To be honest, don't use this spell that often, but I'm sort of looking at it now to evaluate, and I'm thinking, actually, I should be using this spell more often, because if you can land it against a boss or something like that, it's going to take them out of the fight, or make their fighting significantly worse for the entire rest of the fight. Disadvantage on all their attacks and advantage on all your attacks is very, very strong, and something that is definitely worth trying to land. I'm going to put this in B tier because there are better CC options, but I think the fact that it lasts for 10 turns based on only 1 save really gives it a niche that other crowd control spells don't have in Baldur's Gate. Most of the other hard CC effects only last for 3 turns, or are concentration, or only last for 1 turn, and so on. And this is one of the hardest crowd control effects that you can get at a pretty low level that lasts for this long without using your concentration. So yeah, just having only 1 save and being a reasonable effect, not taking concentration, pretty good spell. I think B tier, use it against bosses if you know that the fight's going to go long. Otherwise, you're better off casting Command or something like that, but if you know that the fight is going to last 4 or 5 rounds, then Blindness can be very good. Blur. Blur is a 10-turn self-cast concentration spell, and it gives attackers disadvantage on attacks against you. Blur is a defensive spell, which spells that are just defensive and you have to spend an action on them always struggle a little bit in Baldur's Gate. You can in Dungeons and Dragons in general. You can precast this spell, and probably the best use for this is to precast it as a druid, a Circle of the Land druid, before wild shaping, because that actually makes it much more likely that you'll stay in wild shape. Disadvantage on attacks against you is a pretty good use of a spell for a druid. But in general, the fact that it's self-cast only holds this spell back significantly, because you aren't able to put it on a character that you know is going to get hit. And it's concentration, so obviously on your spellcasters who want to be concentrating on other stuff, this comes at a significant opportunity cost. I wouldn't recommend casting Blur that often, but I will say that specifically for a wild shaping druid, this can be an interesting choice for your 1 concentration spell if you are looking to just melee for that encounter. Compared to the other concentration spells for level 2 for druids, you are probably not going to cast this over Flaming Sphere, for example, but there are some fights where the Flaming Sphere won't be helpful, or the Web or Entangle won't be helpful, but Blur might be. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in marginal tier, but I would say it's definitely on the low end of marginal tier. Branding Smite. Branding Smite is another one of the Paladin Smite spells, so you have to compare it not only to other level 2 spells, but also to just making a level 2 Smite attack as a Paladin. It is a bonus action, so it eats your bonus action, just like all of these other Smite spells, unlike normal Smites, and does 2d6 of extra radiant damage, and prevent the enemy hit from going invisible. The duration for that is your concentration, so you have to concentrate on it to stop them from going invisible, which is pretty bad, just as an effect. It also does not scale well, gaining only 1d6 of extra damage per level. So right away, comparing this to a level 2 Smite attack, you're getting 2d6 of radiant damage for 3d8 of radiant damage, and losing your concentration and your bonus action, instead of 3d8 radiant damage, and losing your concentration and your bonus action. So the effect really needs to be pretty powerful for that to be something that you want to do. And it's not. Preventing an enemy from going invisible really struggles for many reasons. One, there's a lot of easy ways to knock enemies out of invisibility. Create Water or Fairy Fire does that much, much more easily. And two, you have to land it before they go invisible. You can't target them once they're already invisible with this, meaning that you have to know in advance that that enemy turns invisible, so you have to have memorized the encounter, or at least, know something about the enemy in advance, and actually hit them with a weapon attack, at which point, you should probably just be smiting them and killing them, because them turning invisible in the middle of a fight is also not going to be that big a deal. The time when you actually care about enemies being invisible is when the fight has just started. Once you've already gotten in a position to hit them with weapon attacks, you don't really care if they go invisible after that. Another issue with this spell, or another thing that is kind of interesting about this spell, is that unlike the other smites, it can be used on ranged attacks. So for a dexterity-based paladin, like the Oath of the Ancients paladin build I posted fairly recently, who will actually sometimes use archery attacks, it can be nice to have a spell that you can use alongside your ranged attacks. But that being said, that's such a marginal use, and the power level of this spell is so low compared to just hitting with a normal smite attack. We're going to put this in D tier, alongside basically all of the paladin's special smites, unfortunately. Calm Emotions. Calm Emotions is not on this tier list. Oh, here it is, all the way at the bottom. There we go. Calm Emotions is a concentration-based buff that lasts for 10 turns and prevents characters in it from being charmed, frightened, or entering a rage. You can use this offensively against enemy barbarians to stop them from entering a rage, but this is basically a party buff that prevents charm or frightened. It also immediately ends those effects if cast on a character suffering from them. So if an ally is already charmed or already frightened, you can use Calm Emotions to break them out of that state immediately. Obviously, this loses some value if you have an allied barbarian, because it'll prevent them from raging, which is pretty bad. But overall, Calm Emotions is a pretty powerful buff for the encounters where it's useful. There's a number of encounters that are completely solved by having access to Charm Immunity or Frighten Immunity, and especially very early in the game, one of the encounters that people find the hardest, and one I see frequently mentioned as one that gives people trouble, is the Harpy encounter. Calm Emotions immediately solves that encounter by preventing the Harpy's charm from working at all, so you just have to worry about their weapon attacks. Now, it is a concentration spell, so you can lose concentration on this if you get hit, but Calm Emotions is really good, and I think stays relevant throughout the game. There's a lot of people who've put this on tier lists as very, very low tier, like F tier, D tier, whatever their tier list is, and I disagree with that, because Frightened Immunity and Charm Immunity are both relevant throughout the game. Having this prepared can be a really good panic button if you go into an encounter where an enemy lands an effect that you were not expecting. There's a reason that we spend a lot of effort when building characters to boost wisdom saves, because those are crippling effects to get hit by, Charm and Frightened, and those are two of the things that most commonly target your wisdom. So having Calm Emotions to either preemptively prevent those or break people out of them after they've already been hit by them is pretty good. Is this something that I would have prepared like every adventuring day? Maybe not, but I think that having it in your back pocket, and when you are sort of higher level and looking for a last couple spells to fill out your last few spell slots, this is definitely one that you should consider keeping with you at all times. Obviously, if you have Hero's Feast up, it loses some value because you already have Frighten, but that's not until character level 11 that you're going to get Hero's Feast. Up until then, Calm Emotions is very powerful. I'm going to put it in B tier because I think that it's worth emphasizing how useful it is to have access to this spell. You probably won't use it every single day, but it will get a lot of use if you bring it regularly and be very powerful. And it's one of the best ways to stop some of the most crippling effects in the game from affecting you. Cloud of Daggers. Cloud of Daggers is a small AoE concentration spell that does 4d4 of damage to anything that starts their turn in it or enters it. The or enters it is pretty important because you can push enemies into it and they will take 4d4 of damage. Now, the AoE, the radius is very small on Cloud of Daggers, and that means that it is very hard to hit more than like maximum 2 enemies with it. There's some arenas where it's a little easier, but most of the time you're going to be getting this on 1 or 2 enemies at most. And you'll get the damage when you cast it, because they take the damage immediately, and then you get the damage again when they start their turn in it, and then if you push them into it, they will take the damage again, and then take the damage a second time when they start their turn in it. So this will often double up on damage. The fact that it's actually 8d8 of damage on anything that you cast it on immediately, because they take damage instantly and then again at the beginning of their turn, means this is actually pretty good damage for a level 2 spell, even though it looks like it's not going to be. And the fact that it's 4d4 means it's very predictable. The distribution of damage is very predictable. More smaller dice are usually better, because while the average damage stays the same as like if you had a d16, it would be not significantly less average damage, but it tightens the distribution towards the center, so you will get very predictable amounts of damage out of this. I've said many times that the enemy of optimization is randomness, so the closer you can get to something just doing a predictable amount of damage, the better. Also, the enemy of optimization is randomness. This has no save. So Cloud of Daggers is guaranteed damage. Much like Magic Missile, this is a way to finish off low health enemies, but unlike Magic Missile, it also will contribute great damage throughout the fight. It's a great spell to concentrate on, one of the best for any character to, like, you'll never be sad to be concentrating on Cloud of Daggers in a fight. Just an incredible spell. It even scales reasonably well, gaining 2d4 extra damage every spell level. Typically, a d8 is standard scaling for adding higher level spells, so 2d4 is slightly better scaling than a d8, and Cloud of Daggers therefore benefits actually reasonably well from being upcast, especially because on the first target that you cast it on, all of that damage is always doubled. Cloud of Daggers, I think, is just an incredible spell. S-tier spell. I think it's probably the only damage spell you're ever going to see me put in S-tier, but that's because it's so reliable, other than, I guess, Magic Missile. But like Magic Missile, it's incredibly reliable, breaks concentration as well very effectively, because it's going to force enemies to make multiple saves, can be used with pushes and repositions for even more damage. Just an incredible spell that you're going to want on basically every character that has access to it. Anything that can never fail is always worth looking at, and Cloud of Daggers will never fail you. Crown of Madness. Crown of Madness is suffers, unfortunately, in Baldur's Gate because it's bugged and just doesn't work, at least some of the time. So how it's supposed to work is it's a concentration-based 3-turn spell that forces an enemy to attack the nearest thing to them with a melee attack instead of whatever else they were going to do on their turn. However, at least half the time I've cast this spell, they just take a normal turn anyways. They don't hit an ally, they run off after your party members and just whack them anyways. I think the issue is that the way Baldur's Gate AI works, and I'm just speculating here, is that the way Baldur's Gate AI works is it decides on its movement before it decides on its attack, and so it moves, gets next to a party member, and then Crown of Madness forces them to hit that party member, rather than how it should work, where it forces them to attack their nearest ally right away. So the fact that it doesn't work holds this spell back, and it's already not an amazing spell. Like, it's okay, but for crowd control spells like this, you would probably rather have command or something like that. If it worked, I would put it in B tier. Since it doesn't work, unfortunately, we're going to have to bump it down to D tier. If you have found it consistently working, then it could go up some tiers, but it just doesn't. So, in my experience, so I certainly cannot rate it very highly here. This, again, with an asterisk, I would love to rate this spell higher, B or A tier, if it consistently worked and worked the way it's supposed to in tabletop, but since it doesn't in Baldur's Gate, then we can't give it a very high rating. Darkness. Darkness is a concentration spell that creates an AoE, much like Fog Cloud, in which characters are blinded. However, it has two important differences in Baldur's Gate from Fog Cloud. One is that warlocks with Devil's Sight can see through it, meaning that warlocks, who are the ones who have easiest access to the darkness spell, can see through their own clouds of darkness. And two, in Baldur's Gate, darkness actually prevents enemies from making ranged attacks or targeting characters inside the darkness cloud. Fog Cloud should do that. It does in tabletop, but in Baldur's Gate they've decided to differentiate the two spells by making darkness the only one that actually prevents ranged attacks. So that effect by itself is ridiculously powerful. Darkness, I think, is the single best defensive action in the game because it provides no save, no questions asked, immunity to ranged attacks, forcing enemies to enter melee with you where they will be blinded and make their attacks with advantage. It also gives you, while you're standing inside it as a warlock, advantage on all of your attacks because you won't be blinded by the Devil's Sight. You can use this on your party as well, even if they aren't immune to blind. Enemies who come into the darkness cloud to attack them will get advantage because your party's blinded, but disadvantage because the enemy's blinded. So they won't be making their attacks at advantage. But the fact that this just completely shuts down mages and archers all by itself makes this an incredible spell. I think it is, like I said, the single best defensive action in the game, bar maybe none, and is very, very powerful throughout the game. This will stay relevant. I have made, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 builds whose entire purpose is abusing darkness. So that will tell you how much I love this spell. S tier spell. Darkvision. We are missing Darkvision, but there's a second darkness. All right, let's see if we can do some. I'm going to do some live HTML here. Try to get this this image fixed. I'm sure this is riveting YouTube for everybody. All right, did that work? Haha! Nailed it. All right, slightly low resolution because I just copied the link from the wiki, but there we go. Darkvision. So Darkvision is a spell that lasts all of your rests. It's a long rest duration spell, and gives you the ability to see in the dark, much like it says in the name. No concentration, so it's low opportunity cost, but obviously costs a level 2 spell slot to use. If you're getting this for free from a camp follower, it's going to be different. This is another one that you can get from a camp follower, but again, like most of these spells, I'm going to be assuming that you are actually casting them with your party rather than getting them for free from a hireling. So we will be judging it based on that. Baldur's Gate does not really deal with lighting in the game. Lighting is just not important. If this were Solasta Crown of the Magister, Darkvision would be wildly important because that game actually really, really cares about the lighting effects in 5th edition, but in Baldur's Gate, most arenas are lit. It's very easy to get light effects. A lot of characters just have native dark vision anyways. I have never found a situation where I wished I had dark vision, and I just don't think it's worth spending a level 2 spell slot on. If you ever do need it, then you can use a potion or something like that, but for that, but in general, you're going to be better off just lighting the thing that you're trying to target. I would not recommend taking Dark Vision D-tier spell. Detect Thoughts. Detect Thoughts is a ritual, which means it does not take a spell slot to cast, which is always what we like to see, and lasts until your long rest, not that that really matters with a ritual spell. It's used in dialogue to detect characters' thoughts. There's no use outside of dialogue, so Detect Thoughts can only be used in scripted events where they've said, here's a place where you can detect someone's thoughts. Usually this use is to skip having to make a charisma skill check of some kind. Usually you'll have the option to either make a persuasion check or Detect Thoughts, learn something, and use that to pass the dialogue check. But a level 2 spell for passing a dialogue check is not a good trade. Or it wouldn't be a good trade, but it's a ritual spell. However, unlike other ritual spells, it's not free, because if they pass the saving throw, then on Tactician or Honor mode, just like with the Friend spell, they'll get hostile. And also, there's a couple encounters where detecting thoughts is actually actively dangerous to you because the characters are so powerful. In general, I think that you don't need to detect thoughts. It's basically free, so there's no reason not to bring it. And it's a great role-playing option, so obviously if you like to roleplay with Detect Thoughts and reading people's minds, then that's great. But the fact that it is a dialogue option that will work less often than just making a persuasion check usually. Like, usually a character that's optimized for charisma is going to pass their persuasion checks way more easily than enemies will fail the save against Detect Thoughts. And the fact that all it does is let you skip skill checks that you probably want to be making anyways. I'm going to say that Detect Thoughts is marginal. If you are a non-charisma face character, then you can get some use out of Detect Thoughts. And I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 encounters in the game where Detect Thoughts gets you something you can't get just by making a charisma skill check, but overall it's not going to be tremendously useful, and I wouldn't recommend bringing it unless you're a character that particularly needs it. Enhance Ability. Enhance Ability is a concentration spell that gives you, much like Guidance, improves your skill checks. It gives you advantage on skill checks as opposed to Guidance's 1d4. Advantage on most skill checks is worth about 4.5, so it's going to be better than Guidance, but it comes at the expense of costing a level 2 spell slot rather than being a cantrip. It also still takes your concentration, and you can't have the same character use Guidance and Enhance Ability, so you should usually choose Guidance over Enhance Ability. Also, importantly, it's differentiated from Tabletop in that it doesn't give you advantage on initiative checks, because in Tabletop D&D, initiative is just a dexterity ability check, so things that improve your dexterity ability checks will improve your initiative. So Enhance Ability can be used on that. Jack of all trades can be used on initiative as well. Those don't work in Baldur's Gate. It doesn't count as a dexterity check, a dexterity ability check, so Enhance Ability does not work on initiative in Baldur's Gate, even if you choose Dex for it. Usually you're going to be wanting to use this in response to a very important skill check that you have to make. Is it worth bringing it as a prepared spell? Maybe. I think that I would say most of the time you're going to be better off not wasting a level 2 spell slot on Enhance Ability to try to pass a specific dialogue check. You're better off just using Guidance and Inspiration, which Inspiration gives you sort of 4 advantages already. You get 4 rerolls if you've been storing up Inspiration, which makes Enhance Ability significantly less useful, although it does stack with Inspiration. You can reroll with the advantage from Enhance Ability. I think there's only a couple skill checks in the game that are both important to pass and so hard that you'd want to burn a level 2 spell slot on, for those, it's pretty good. And it's never a terrible thing to have in your back pocket, you just won't be casting it that often. I'm going to put it in C tier, but in general, I think you're better off most of the time just rolling the checks without spending a level 2 spell slot. If there's a check you know you want to pass, then you can definitely cast this. But in general, you're better off just using guidance and having the skills high already, using inspiration if you fail die rolls. Even on honor mode, I wouldn't recommend spending a level 2 spell slot on most skill checks in the game, so we're going to put it in C tier. Enlarge Reduce. Enlarge Reduce is a concentration spell that makes you bigger, or makes you smaller, or makes something smaller. You can make any creature larger or any creature smaller. Typically, you're going to make an ally bigger and an enemy smaller if that's something that you want. It increases, if you make somebody bigger, then it increases their damage by a d4, which isn't terrible for a buff, but for a concentration buff is pretty weak. And gives them advantage on strength checks and saving throws, and they also weigh more, which matters for some builds. Increasing your character's weight actually does matter for some things, but for the most part, it's just going to be an extra d4 of damage, and for your concentration, that's not good. Reduce is similar, but the opposite. It reduces an enemy damage by 1d4, which also is just not worth it for your concentration. I mean, compare this to Blindness, which has no concentration and reduces enemy damage on average by way more by giving them disadvantage. It's going to be way better than casting Reduce on an enemy. One use for Reduce is fitting through small gaps, and if you are a small race or combine with Disguise Self to disguise yourself as a small race, you can fit even through the tiny gaps like pipes and cracks in the stone and whatever. So that is a minor use for that, although often you're better off having a familiar or a mage hand do those things. I think that Enlarge Reduce... And the other thing that I should mention is that by far the best use of Enlarge Reduce is on a Dwergar, who gets it for free as a non-concentration version and can just become bigger. So Enlarge Reduce in that situation, where it's resource-free, is incredibly strong, obviously. But for a level 2 spell slot, I would not recommend using this in combat. You can gain some minor utility with it out of combat, but even then, I think it is going to be significantly weaker than just about every other combat option. If cast for its intended purpose of increasing your damage, then it's bad in combat, and the out-of-combat utility can be duplicated by most other things. Enthrall. Enthrall is a 10-turn duration, non-concentration spell. Important that it's not concentration, I guess. The enemy that you target with it, or the character you target with it, makes a wisdom save or has to look at you. Importantly, this doesn't count as a hostile action, so you can use it on NPCs safely. They won't get mad. But its main use for stealing stuff, you can duplicate much more easily with Minor Illusion. So forcing an enemy, like distracting a character by making them look at you and then pickpocketing them or stealing stuff from them is the intended use, but they'll already go check out a Minor Illusion, which is a cantrip rather than a level 2 spell, so in that sense it has no use there. However, there is kind of a weird interaction with Enthrall, where if you steal something from someone and they go, huh, my thing is missing, and go to investigate, and then you hit them with Enthrall, they forget that their thing was missing, and you never have to deal with the investigation. That being said, you can also do this just by leaving the area. If you just steal something and then leave, it does exactly the same thing. And that use is buggy, requires specific timing as well. And overall, I wouldn't recommend actually spending a spell slot on that. If you want to steal stuff, just use Fog Cloud, use Minor Illusion. Don't use Enthrall. And if you want to break enemy AI investigations, just leave the area and come back, and they'll have forgotten that you stole something from them anyways. D tier spell. Flame Blade. It's funny that this tier list is like all out of order. Or, oh no, we just have extra copies of a few spells here. Alright, that's fine. I will put these at the bottom. Flameblade. So, Flameblade is a bonus action self-cast spell that creates a scimitar in your hand that does 3d6 of fire damage and sheds bright light, which I suppose is relevant. Because it's a bonus action, you can cast this and then still attack with it. But it just the problem with this weapon summon is that it just does 3d6 of damage. There's no good way to improve it. Like, it won't add your ability scores to that damage. It just hits for 3d6 as spell damage. There might be some damage writer source stacking bugs with this that I'm unaware of, but I don't like to judge things based on that. And even then, I don't think that's a good use for the spell. Spending a bonus action for 3d6 of damage that you then have to hit with, or spending a level 2 spell for 3d6 damage that you then have to hit with in melee as a druid is not something that I will typically want to do. It does not combo very well with Spore Druid's additional damage, because you'd rather just make weapon attacks with that. It has some uses because it's not concentration, and at early levels it can increase your damage very slightly, but in general I would not recommend using Flameblade. Instead, just cast basically any other spell and just make a normal weapon attack. For a Moon Druid, obviously, your bonus action is going to be turning into Wild Shape. For a Land Druid, you probably don't want to be in melee, so this would only be useful for a Spore Druid in general. And even there, it's just not enough damage to justify a level 2 spell slot. You'll get way more damage out of other spell slots, so don't use Flameblade. It's a D tier spell. Flaming Sphere. Flaming Sphere this is a spell that works significantly differently than it does in tabletop D&D also, so a couple of the summons have major differences as to how they work in tabletop, but basically in Baldur's Gate what it does is it summons a sphere that acts independently of you and has hit points and can be targeted by enemies. It lasts for 10 turns, takes your concentration, and it will attack enemies by itself on its turn for 2d6 of damage with a dexterity save for half. Now, 2d6 of damage with a dexterity save for half, even if you get it for 10 times, is terrible damage. Just not good damage. But it does two things that are incredibly powerful for this spell. It does two things that make this spell incredibly powerful. Just tripped over my words a little there. One, it's a summon with hit points that enemies can target, and it has like low AC and stuff, so they will target it. You will often have the AI waste turns attacking your Flaming Sphere. Two, it blocks doorways, so you can use this as to block enemies from getting to you. Unlike Arcane Lock or whatever, it won't break the AI, they'll just have to attack the Flaming Sphere, but forcing them to spend their turn attacking the Flaming Sphere or move around is really nice. And three, it can set stuff on fire, which is very relevant in a lot of encounters where you can create pools of fire on the ground, causing enemies to take additional damage. So the actual damage that it does is often a little more than the 2d6 with dex save for half. I would say that this spell is very powerful and one that you are going to use pretty often, even on into the sort of mid-game. You probably by the late game will have way better things to concentrate on, but Flaming Sphere is a great way to give your party more hit points effectively, as well as distract enemies, while offering a little bit of action-free damage to your party. If you get, 20 damage out of it, which isn't that unreasonable, then it's done pretty well. For a level 2 spell slot, you'll get... It's still a little behind a pure damage spell slot at that point, but in the meantime, it's also distracted enemies, blocked their pathing, set the ground on fire to deal extra damage, and possibly absorbed several attacks from enemies. Great spell that you should pretty much always bring on every character that casts it. It's what you'll usually want to be concentrating on before you wild shape as a druid at this level. It's also one of the best things for wizards to concentrate on at this level as well. Just an excellent spell that you should bring most of the time. A tier spell. I'm not going to put it up in S tier because it is a somewhat inefficient use for damage, but the fact that it will also absorb a lot of damage itself makes it a great spell. Gust of Wind. Gust of Wind just pushes an enemy. So it's a strength saving throw, or they get thrown 17 feet backwards, and it is a pretty big AoE. A 40-foot line of AoE is pretty large, so you can use this to push a lot of enemies from a pretty far distance. It's a strength save, which gives it slightly lower utility because that's one that a lot of enemies you would want to push often have high strength saves. It also does make them off balance, which is not a particularly powerful, which is a reasonably powerful effect, excuse me, that gives you advantage on attack rolls against them as well. So advantage on attack rolls is not terrible, but mostly you're just using this for the push. The question, of course, when you're casting Gust of Wind is why are you not casting Thunderwave or just shoving? And the answer is that usually there's no reason not to just cast Thunderwave or shove. Thunderwave is a con save, so it's slightly worse, but a strength save is still bad, is still not a great save to target. You can use it to push enemies into chasms and instantly kill them, but that does cost you loot. You can use it to push enemies off of cliffs and stuff. But because Baldur's Gate gives you such easy access to shoves, I think that Gust of Wind in general is not going to show up that often. It's one I don't hate having prepared some of the time, but in general, I wouldn't recommend this. So I think that I will put it in D tier. I could see bumping it up to C tier potentially, but I would, generally speaking, not recommend casting Gust of Wind most of the time because it's duplicated by the easy access to shoves that you get just from the athletic skill in Baldur's Gate, which don't take an action and are more likely to work usually as well, because they target a skill check rather than a saving throw. So, in general, I'm going to suggest not taking Gust of Wind most of the time. Heat Metal. And I think this is where we're going to make the cut for part 2 of the level 2 spells tier list, because this is starting to get pretty long, I would say, as well, and we're just about halfway through. But Heat Metal is a bard or druid spell that is concentration and does a whole bunch of things. So it's cast on a metal weapon or armor, so a character with a metal weapon or metal armor can be affected by heat metal. And if they get hit by it, then they either have to drop it or have disadvantage on attack rolls and skill checks. As well, they take 2d8 of damage, and you can use your bonus action to deal 2d8 more damage. Unlike some other effects where you have to reapply it every turn or you lose it, you don't have to do this every turn as long as heat metal is up, but getting a bonus action to do 2d8 more fire damage is pretty good. Heat metal in Baldur's Gate works very, very weirdly. It does not work the way that it does in tabletop. So, for one thing, a lot of enemies who should have metal count as having metal weapons or metal armor aren't tagged with it and can't be targeted by heat metal, which is very annoying. So a lot of things you think you should be able to target, you can't. And when cast on a weapon, the AI will always opt to drop it, so it forces them to drop it immediately, but then they will just pick it back up and not be affected by the heat metal effect anymore. So you have to, if you are going to cast it on an enemy weapon, the heat metal effect will disappear sometimes when they drop the weapon because it's applied to the character, not the weapon, and then they can pick it back up and lose the heat metal effect. This doesn't happen every time, and I'm not 100% sure what triggers this bug, but it is a bug that is annoying for the spell. Also, something else that's kind of annoying about it is that if a character has a metal weapon and metal armor, it will always target the weapon. You can't choose to target the armor, so they always get the option to drop the weapon and not suffer from the disadvantage for the rest of the combat. That being said, disadvantage on everything and bonus damage for your concentration action is very powerful. Forcing enemies to drop their weapons is still pretty good, because as long as they aren't the next character to act, you can have somebody run in and scoop up the weapon, taking their weapon away. The ability to just spend your bonus action to do 2d8 of fire damage for the whole encounter is pretty nice, especially for a bard or a druid, both of whom want something that they're just concentrating on for the encounter while they do other stuff. Especially for druids, you can precast this and then enter wild shape and just have heat metal going. You won't be able to use the bonus action to reapply the damage, but the disadvantage will stay for the entire encounter, so that part is good. And for bards, it's one of your most consistent sources of damage if you can heat metal on an enemy. I think even despite the bugs and the sort of annoying targeting restrictions in Baldur's Gate and the way it doesn't work the way you sort of want it to in tabletop, this is still a great spell that I'm going to rate A tier. Good damage, great utility, very powerful, doesn't work against every enemy, including some that it really should work against, but there's a lot of encounters that this is just incredibly strong in, and they don't get a save after they fail the first save, so they're just stuck with disadvantage forever. And so it's very similar in that way to Blindness, where you can give them permanent disadvantage for a fight, but unlike Blindness, it also adds damage and can be used to make them drop their weapon, so it's very good in that sense. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed part 1 of our Tier 2 spells tier list, and as always, of course, let me know in the comments what you'd like to see moved around or changed, and if you have enjoyed the video, of course, feel free to leave comments and like the video. Both of those things help out a ton with the algorithm, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.